The Beach is an adventure fiction novel by Alex Garland, first published in 1996. Written during Garland's time in the Philippines, the book was inspired by the region's landscapes and historical events, such as the Vietnam War. In 2000, it was adapted into a successful film starring Leonardo DiCaprio and directed by Danny Boyle. The novel also earned a spot on the BBC's list of the most read books in the UK in 2003. The story follows Richard, a young man born in 1974 during the Vietnam War, who arrives in Bangkok, Thailand, eager for adventure. However, he is disappointed by the city, which feels just as foreign and uncomfortable as his own home. At his guest house, Richard encounters Daffy, a man who mutters about a mysterious beach and tosses a joint at him. The next day, Richard discovers a map left on his door, marking a hidden beach on an island near Koh Samui. When Richard goes to ask Daffy about the map, he finds Daffy dead from suicide, an event that deeply disturbs him. Richard soon meets Etienne, a Frenchman, who shares his dissatisfaction with Thailand. Upon hearing about the beach, Etienne's girlfriend, Françoise, becomes eager to visit. The trio embarks on a journey to Koh Samui, where they meet Sammy and Zeph. When Zeph mentions a mysterious beach, Françoise panics, prompting Richard to share the map with the group. That night, Richard dreams of war games with Daffy in Vietnam. The next day, the group continues their journey to Koh Ang Thong, a key stop on the way to the beach. After a grueling swim to the final island, Richard reflects on a moment when he throws a cigarette butt in the bushes, marking a point where he no longer recognizes himself. The group eventually discovers a marijuana field and encounters armed guards. From a cliff, they glimpse a lagoon and waterfall, which leads them to Jed, who guides them to the beach. At the beach, they meet Sal and Bugs, who seem to lead the encampment made up of huts and tents. Richard, exhausted and overwhelmed, faints upon arrival, suffering from a fever and delirium, during which he dreams of Daffy. The next day, his reality blurs with dreams and paranoia. Sal explains the beach is a retreat from the conventional resort life, but Richard feels increasingly isolated. He later discovers that Etienne and Françoise are part of a group spearing fish. Etienne introduces Richard to others, including Gregorio, a warm and friendly man. Richard's love of video games leads him to Kitty, a man playing a Game Boy, who invites Richard to play. As Richard becomes more integrated into the island community, he, Etienne, and Françoise are given seashell necklaces, signifying their full acceptance into the group. Richard embraces spearfishing and enjoys diving to explore the coral reefs. He becomes so immersed in island life that he forgets about the outside world, including the map he once kept. When the rice spoils, Richard and Jed volunteer to go to Koh Phangan, the nearest city on the mainland. They must swim through a cave to reach the hidden boat, but halfway through, Richard gets trapped in an air pocket. Determined to survive, he picks a tunnel at random and eventually emerges safely. On the open water, Richard and Jed nervously approach Koh Phangan. They split up in the city, and when they reunite, Jed reveals he overheard Americans discussing a map to a beach and mentioning Richard. Richard admits he had given them a map in case he got lost, and Jed forgives him. Back at the beach, Richard quickly returns to the rhythm of island life, forgetting about Koh Phangan. As torrential rains hit and food becomes scarce, Richard manages to spear a large shark, providing enough for everyone to eat. One day, while exploring the jungle, Richard discovers papaya trees. Sal then asks if he's willing to take up a position in the jungle with Jed so that Kitty can focus on fishing. Reluctantly, Richard agrees. Soon, Richard and Jed learn that Sammy and Zeph, the men Richard had given the map to, have reached a neighboring island with some others. They appear unsure of how to proceed, but Jed insists they must prevent them from reaching their island. Richard takes to his new lookout position, feeling like a soldier in the jungles of Vietnam. While exploring one day, he finds the papaya grove he'd discovered earlier, but Bugs claims it as his own, angering Richard. That evening, Richard is called to the lagoon by Kitty, Etienne, and Françoise, who show him the beauty of the phosphorescent algae glowing in the moonlight. The next day, most of the camp falls violently ill after eating a dead squid Kitty mistakenly caught. Bugs defecates on himself, and Richard refuses to help. Enraged, Bugs criticizes Richard for his lack of compassion, while Richard tends to Françoise, giving her water and a kiss on the cheek. Etienne sees the kiss and is upset. The next day, Bugs punches Kitty for not helping during the chaos, causing a divide between the groups. Richard hears that the Swedish men, Christo, Sten, and Carl, never returned from fishing. Soon, Carl returns with Sten's body, which had been partially eaten by a shark. Sten is dead, and Carl seems to have lost his grip on reality. Richard searches for Christo and finds him in the air pocket in the caves, alive but gravely injured. Christo is placed in a tent with Jed, and when Richard checks on him, he finds his stomach blackened and hardened. Jed believes Christo is deteriorating and complains that no one comes to visit him. The camp has seemingly forgotten about Christo, and Sten's body, now decomposing behind the tent, is a grim reminder of their isolation. Carl, in shock, refuses to leave the hole he has dug on the beach. As Richard's mind unravels, he starts seeing Daffy during waking hours and feels disconnected, as if trapped in the chaos of Vietnam. He becomes reckless, ignoring the presence of drug guards and forgetting to check for Sammy and Zeph. A funeral is held for Christo, and Sal demands that everyone put aside their differences. Richard is disturbed by how quickly the group moves on from the Swedes. While on lookout, Richard realizes that Sammy and Zeph have built a raft and are making their way toward the island. Richard informs Sal about what happened, and she hopes that the visitors will be stopped by the drug fields or waterfall. Jed, however, says he no longer cares about the beach. The following morning, Richard is instructed to head to the lookout and wait for Sammy and Zeph. From his vantage point, he watches as they reach the cannabis fields and begin to celebrate by grabbing plants, only for a guard to appear, gun in hand. In an instant, all 5 visitors are beaten. Richard's mind drifts to Daffy, who urges him to help, but Richard remains motionless, unable to act. He watches helplessly as his friends are dragged away and hears their gunshots. With his head spinning, Richard returns to camp and tells Sal. In the aftermath, Richard confronts Carl, blaming him for the chaos. Carl lurches at him, and Richard tries to suffocate him in anger, but Carl breaks free and runs past the camp, leaving everyone stunned. Richard lies, claiming Carl attacked him for no reason. He then checks on Jed, who says that all he sees in Richard is Daffy. That night, Richard dreams of Daffy, who tells him that the beach was never meant to last, implying that everything Richard did to protect it, including letting others die, was ultimately pointless. In another dream, Daffy recounts the beach's discovery, explaining that places like it are impossible to protect, and no single person or thing is responsible for its inevitable destruction. Richard comes to a painful realization that all the selfish, dark actions he took to preserve the beach were in vain. He wanted Vietnam, and he got it. The next morning, Sal indirectly asks Richard to kill Carl. Richard sets out to find Carl and deceive Sal into believing he has done so. Upon reaching the cave, Richard realizes the boat is gone, meaning Carl has left with it. Richard lies to Sal, claiming that Carl is dead. Etienne later finds Richard by the caves and apologizes for overreacting about the kiss. Richard asks Etienne if he wants to leave the island, and Etienne goes off to convince Françoise to do the same. Richard seeks out Jed and Kitty. When Kitty notices the boat is missing, he blames himself and expresses a strong desire to leave. Jed, however, states he will only leave if Christo is dead before then. Richard finds Jed asleep, and in an unsettling act, he suffocates Christo to free Jed from the island's grip. On the beach, Richard realizes that the remaining residents have become eerily strange. He knows it's time to leave when Daffy appears to him once more. At that moment, the drug guards emerge from the jungle and drag Richard forward. They accuse the beach dwellers of making a map and bringing others to the island. They beat Richard and leave the bodies of the rafters on the sand. Sal attempts to move the bodies but slips and falls on Sammy. Bugs, in a fit of madness, begins hacking at Sammy's body, eventually decapitating him. Soon, others join in, slowly dissecting the bodies. When Sal discovers the note Richard had left for Sammy and Zeph, the group realizes that Richard had invited them to the island, and they begin stabbing him. In a desperate act, Kitty, Etienne, Jed, and Françoise grab spears and defend Richard, dragging him away and escaping on the raft. As they sail back toward Bangkok, they talk amongst themselves. Afterward, Richard never sees Françoise or Etienne again, although he hopes to. He maintains his friendships with Kitty and Jed, though he carries the scars of the island with him forever. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and be sure to subscribe. Thank you.